live. Hello. Welcome to Chess Openings Explained. I'm Nick Risko, your instructor for tonight, and this is part 3 of our Scotch series. We are going through part 1 was all the third move sidelines black could play, and that featured the Napoleon Gambit. Part 2 is all about the Bishop C5 Scotch Gambit lines. And here, part 3, we're going to be covering the Knight F6 Scotch Gambit lines, including the Nakmansen Gambit, the one and only. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to cover the Scotch Gambit position here. We have our Scotch starting position. And after takes, the Scotch Gambit is with Bishop to C4. You don't recapture on D4 right away. Instead, you're just giving that pawn up for free in order to get activity with your pieces. So here after Bishop C4, Black does have two main options. They have Bishop to C5 and they have Knight to F6. Now again, in part 2, we looked at all the Bishop to C5 options. Tonight, we're looking at Knight to F6. We have Tracy coming in. Hi, Tracy. We're fixing the camera. Awesome. Okay. So after Knight to F6, White has a couple different options, but we're going to be focusing on two main options tonight. Our two main options are going to be pawn to E5, and we're also going to be looking at castles kingside. So these are two moves we're going to investigate. So here, after Knight to F6, in the Lee Chess database, this is known as the Dubois Reti defense, and White most popularly continues with the move E5. And it makes some sense. You're hitting the knight that just moved, and if it moves back to G8, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense here as the knight has already moved. So we're going to take a look at the main line with D5, and then we're going to look at the two sidelines Black has with knight to G4 and knight to E4, both of which I believe are playable. So okay, after E5, our main line is pawn to D5, and the point is you're ignoring the fact White is hitting your knight because you are making a threat to capture on C4. And this may be a favorable trade to Black because if they can take on C4, one, they get the bishop pair, which can be a nice benefit in this open position, and two, once they capture, these are two connected pawns in the center, so a lot of center control. So White doesn't really want to allow them to take on C4, so taking on F6 would be a mistake. Instead, White does best simply by playing Bishop to B5, and what they're doing here is creating a pin, and this knight is no longer putting pressure on E5, and it's also no longer guarding D4, because this is an absolute pin. So here, Black normally continues with knight to E4. Your knight was still attacked, so you have to move it. And what better place than a centralized square supported by a pawn? We have Nikki Christopher in the chat. Hello. Gone up about 300 ratings since switching to the Scotch. That's awesome to hear. It's awesome. 300 rating points with the Scotch. I wish I gained 300 rating points when I switched to the Scotch. Okay, so knight E4. How are we going to fight in the center? Well, let's take on D4 with the knight. It would make sense to take with the knight. I believe it's possible to take with the queen because this knight cannot move. However, I like the fact that whenever we recapture with the knight, we are putting more pressure onto C6. So Black now has to respond to this. And they have two options here, two rather good options, I believe. I should also mention the lines we're looking at tonight are not always going to favor White. I believe the Knight F6 lines are a pretty good try against the Scotch Gambit, might be giving it a run for its money. So not everything is going to be all perfect for White. There are going to be lines where White is worse. And before we look at Bishop to D7, we're going to take a look at Bishop to C5. So Bishop to C5 is an interesting move here. You are developing, and the very first question you might have is, why don't we just take on C6 here? Well, if you take on C6 with the knight, Black has this intermezzo with Bishop takes F2 check, and the king has to go to F1, and now they can capture on C6, captures, and then King F8. And after King F8, if you take this rook, it's really bad for White. as bishop a6 is going to come at the king, and the only way to stop this is to give up your queen. So not a big fan of this for white. What happens if you take on c6 with the bishop? They can take with the pawn, and this should be fine, but don't go expecting to take again because of similar ideas of bishop f2 followed by bishop a6. So unfortunately, this just doesn't work. As soon as this b pawn leaves, this is a nice open diagonal for the bishop. So after bishop to c5, white should just simply bring the piece out, bishop to e3, and defend the knight. And now bishop to d7, breaking this pin. And now there is some tension going on in the center. White doesn't need to worry about this. They can capture on c6 with the bishop, and then they will retake with the pawn. And it's a little important they retake with the pawn here. If you trade off the bishop and then there's a trade, I don't see what benefit there is for black for giving up the bishop pair and compromising his, well, not really compromising, but ruining his structure here. So I think it's just best if you take with pawn, keep the bishop on the board. Does give you some nice control over here on the king side, stops moves such as queen to g4. So just take with the pawn, and it's almost like black's dealing with a reverse winnower. At least that's the pattern it reminds me of. But okay, white can castle here, and after castling, queen e7, delaying castling, rook to e1, lining itself up with the queen. And black actually needs to be careful here. This pawn on e5 is not a free pawn. So what happens if black takes? I want to give chat just a second to see if they can find the tactic. Can you believe it? The center is this close and there's a tactic. So rook e1 lined the rook up with the king and the queen. How can we take advantage of this? Anybody in chat? f3 chasing away the knight and threatening to pin the queen by Star Princess 99. That is correct. f3 is the best move in the position. And the point is that if the knight moves somewhere like d6, well, now you can just back your bishop up to f2, and there is this pin of the queen to the king. And blocking with the knight really doesn't help because you win the piece. So if black cannot move this knight, they should just move the bishop back or something and just give up the knight in the first place. In this specific position, you don't even have to take right away. You can let this sit as if the knight does move on black's next turn, you still have bishop to f2. So very nice finding the tactic. So this pawn is poisoned. Black cannot take it. So that's why we will see black castle. After castling, f3 is the main move, kicking the knight out of its nice outpost, and the only square for this knight to go is to g5. Once we see knight to g5, we do see that black still has pressure here with their dark square bishop. Their light squared bishop is on an open diagonal, but not really attacking much. And the knight, to me at least, looks a little out of place because it's really hard to see where it's going other than e6. So we are likely to see black reroute the knight, and white is just going to develop the rest of their pieces with knight c3. After knight e6, we can see white continue with something like queen d2. And now we're starting to get out of the opening a little bit. This is where black can start looking to trade off some pieces, trying to get into some sort of end game. But I did want to show, at least after queen to b4, this does come with a threat. Hitting the bishop and the pawn. The way you can remedy this is actually just giving up the pawn on b2, and white will get almost full compensation here. After a3, threatening to trap the queen with rook to b1. So queen b7, and now after f4, white does have a lot of space for the pawn. A rook will make its way to the b file, maybe find its way on the 7th rank, and hit some targets. So white does have this idea of giving up the pawn, and that is why I continued with this line. So that should cover the the bishop to c5 line here on move 7. The other move black has that is more popular is bishop to d7. And this is interrupting the pin immediately, and white kind of needs to make a decision about what he's going to do on c6. Is he going to trade? Is he not? Well, we notice that if we take with the bishop, black does better to take with the pawn, so we at least get this out of our opponent, that we double up their pawns, and we're going to hope that's going to be a long-term weakness. And we'll see white castle. After castling, black does have another decision to make, and it's about this dark squared bishop and what square they are going to develop to. They can go bishop to e7. This is fine. This is probably the sideline of the position. And we're going to see white very commonly play f3, f4, f5 all in a row. And you do it with tempo on the knight, so black has to do something about this knight. That way you're not just pushing the pawn and they get to make some other improving move. So f3 and the knight moves. Sometimes if it goes to g5, you can just play f4 right away. So after knight c5, we just continue f4, gaining space. And after black castles, we do play f5. And there's this very interesting idea white has of sacrificing both of the pawns in order to try and get at the king. So going with this idea, black goes knight e4. This is also very common. After you move the knight away, as soon as it's available to put the knight back on e4, black can do very well just by putting it there right away. And in this specific scenario, after knight c3 and bishop to c5, we see a trade of knights, and then after king h1, breaking the pin of the knight to the king, and rook e8, we will see white sacrifice the pawns. Starting with e6. So e6 is going to be our big break here. After f takes, instead of taking back on e6, where white is just going to be losing the pawn, we're actually going to push and force black to take with their pawn. They also have rook f8 here. We can go f7 check and the king moves, and bishop to e3, and white is doing pretty well. This pawn is kind of keeping this rook trapped for now, and our knight and bishop are developed. I think this is fine. Black's pawn structure is also not really a structure. These can be weaknesses. So after f6, g takes is the most popular move, and it's met with queen to g4 check. So queen g4 check, king h8 is the only move in this position. If black tries anything else like king to f7, this is met with queen to h5, and if something like king to g8, well, the bishop hangs. So king to h8 is the only move for black. And now the best move for white is to win at least one of the pawns back with queen takes e4. Most often you'll see black trade off the bishop for the knight, and f6 is a big weakness here. If black doesn't protect f6, white can just take with the rook, and we'll have a happy day. But we're going to assume our opponent knows what they're doing. They're going to play e5. They're going to stop you from taking on f6, and now white must keep up the pressure. So they can do this by playing queen h4, and black is just going to have to defend f6 for the time being with rook e6, bishop e3 finally developing the rest of our pieces, queen to e7, and rook a to d1 will activate white's final piece. And this here is a very balanced position for both sides. I think white is doing a very good job at keeping up the pressure. This king on h8 is not as safe as this king on h1. White has both rooks on open files, and again, massive pressure on f6. So I think white is doing just fine here. Some ideas they might, try and play around with is rook f3 to rook h3. This is very direct in putting pressure against the king. Maybe even just going to g3, getting on the file. Yeah, I think there's a lot of play here for white. I think a little bit safer for black, instead of going bishop e7, is going bishop c5 and putting a bit of pressure on this knight right away, asking white what are they going to do. And we're going to see the same theme, f3 hitting the knight, and the knight moves, and f4, and the knight moves back to e4, and we see bishop to e3. After bishop to e3, this bishop is a little loose, so Maybe something like knight f5, looking to trade off the dark square bishops, may be in white's future. Like if black just plays a6 here. Even knight d2, just looking to trade off our kind of undeveloped knight for black's really awesome knight on e4. Should be very good for white. So black backs up this bishop, kind of loses a tempo. They are securing their bishop though, so I will give them that. But white can continue with knight d2, again looking to trade off their knight for black's very active knight on e4. And black really doesn't have anything better to do than trade. If they don't trade it, then white can take, and then the pawn on e4 will become a weakness. In turn, black will get this counterplay with c5. They do have the bishop pair. After the knight moves, d4 hitting the bishop, bishop f2, and bishop to c6. And I do have a lot more moves here, but I don't think it's very important to go through the rest of these. It's like the main line theory I pulled from Lee Chess. But here is pretty much the position that a lot of people, I guess, try to stay away from. If you're white, if you're playing the Scotch Gambit, I don't see why you want to go for this. This is a bit more of a positional approach to the game rather than, you know, cutthroat tactics, checkmating the king. This is going to be a bit more strategic. So if you like that from white, cool, you can go for this. I do want to cover the two sidelines for the Dubois Reti. And then we're going to get into what people play if they don't like this approach. So the first variation we have after knight to f6, e5 is knight to g4. And this is putting pressure on e5 right away. White kind of needs to address this. Immediately, they don't need to. They can castle. If black ends up taking on e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and rook e1 is going to be very good for white. Queen e7 is the best move to protect the knight, but f4 will win the piece. So immediately, it's tactically defended after castles. So black should go bishop to e7. And the point behind bishop e7 over c5 is that you're shutting this file, so rook e1 is not going to be as big of a concern. White will continue with rook e1 anyway to help support this pawn. And now black does best by starting to chip away at this pawn that white has in the center. There's really no reason not to capture, and now black has to make a decision. Do you take on d6 with the queen, or do you take on d6 with the pawn as black? There's definitely arguments to both, but I think the better try might be a little less intuitive. Just catching up on chat here. All right, people are allergic to positional games. Good, because after these two lines, we're not going to look at any more positional stuff. We're going to look at sharp chess. Okay, so after pawn takes on d6, black would love to take with the bishop. Unfortunately, that's not possible. We're going to take a look at queen takes on d6 first. And here, it was a little surprising to me to see how white should continue here. Immediately, I was thinking of something like, okay, maybe g3 and bishop f4, but this seems a little slow. At the same time, there are some other nice ideas. Right now, there's no threat of checkmate because you do have the knight on f3. But one very direct approach is to play b3 and possibly get bishop to b2 and win the d pawn. But maybe even better than that, we can play bishop to a3 and maybe do something about this pinned bishop. So after b3, we see black castle, break the pin, which is what they should do. Bishop to a3, skewering the queen so we can trade off the bishops. And after the knight recaptures, this pawn will hang. We can take with the queen. Queen takes, knight takes. And here, we notice the material is equal. White has their bishop developed on c4, which I don't think is a particularly bad thing. I also don't know if I can quite say this is the absolute best square for the bishop. Naturally, I would put it on d3, but as it is right now on c4, it's perfectly fine. This knight on d4, very well placed, centralized. It's ready to go back to f3 if it's attacked. You may even have knight b5 to c7. And after you move this knight off of b1, you will have very nice development. Now this does still continue. Black does have some nice tries, starting with knight to f5. Your knight was attacked, so you have to do something to defend it. And if you trade, which white normally does, the bishop develops with an attack on the pawn on c2. And here, I think the best try for white is just to go rook e7. I don't care about the c2 pawn. You can take it because I'm putting pressure on your c7 pawn. If you just take on c2, I can take on c7. And here we're doing just fine. There's even ideas of bishop takes f7 and rook takes on c2 if black is not careful. For instance, knight f6. Well, first, b7 hangs. But again, I don't think this idea is too bad either. Just taking the pawn. And here, white is for choice. You have a clean pawn on the king side. So after rook e7, you do see black defend the c7 pawn, still threatening c2, but now, again, instead of reacting to black's threat, white just says, okay, that's fine, I'm going to go bishop to d5, and you can either hit the b7 pawn, or even knight c3 first, with the point being that if the bishop takes on c2, now you can go something like rook c1, and you will have some time to your side. Much more active pieces, I think, in my opinion. So I think this is going to be just fine for white. After pawn takes, you can also take with your own pawn on d6. So Reno84 in the chat says they prefer c takes d6. It seems safer. And I agree. I think this might be a better try for black. With white, one of the lines I found attractive was just bishop to g5. Just hitting this bishop on e7 again and asking black, what are you going to do about this? If they try f6, this is pretty weakening. They'll no longer be able to castle on the king side unless they take drastic measures. So I think this is fine. You can just drop the bishop all the way back to c1 even, and white will be better. So I don't have any problem with bishop to g5 as far as, that's concerned. The real concern is going to be what happens if black blocks the file and then starts trying to trade off pieces. In this scenario, first you have to take on e7. If you don't take on e7, you do run the risk of losing this bishop. So takes, and then bishop to e2. You can save your bishop and just retreat it, and if they take on f3, you can take with the bishop instead of the pawn. So bishop to e2, and I think safest for black is just castle. You don't want to worry about having the queen and the king on the same file as the rook anymore. And here, white can take on d4, and after bishop to e6, I think black has caught up fine. They do have this isolated queen's pawn, which I can't find a way for white to really exploit at this current moment, and the game might just continue with knight to c3 and black bringing their pieces to the center. And this is starting to leave the scope of an opening. This is starting to get into middle game and end game plans. So we're going to cut this off here for knight g4. Someone else in the chat saying if they take the knight, they lose the queen. What are we talking about here? Probably some other line. I missed whenever they put it in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so that covers knight g4. Let's move into fifth move, knight to e4, and then we'll get into what everyone's here for, the Nakmansen. So the last line of the Dubois Reti defense. We have the Scotch Gambit, Dubois Reti. e5, knight to e4. And this is a sideline looking to put pressure on f2. White can do best by castling, securing the f2 square, not really needing to worry about any sacrifices. And black tries with d5, hitting the bishop, supporting the knight, opening up a line for their bishop. And white should take. They take with their pawn, and black takes with their knight. So we're looking at this position. White is down a pawn, and now we see, where Scotch Gambit comes from. White is just down the pawn and needs to rely on their piece activity. Bishop to d5. If you end up going bishop to b3, first, black can end up playing bishop to g4 and be fine after this trade is made. I don't see any problems that have been added to black's position. But I'm also wondering if knight a5 can just be played. It cannot because of queen e1. That would explain why it's not in my notes. Yeah, you can't just try going for this bishop. It does fail. So, okay, bishop d5, a nice active square for the bishop. Here, it can't really get hit by anything. If a bishop to e6 looking for a trade, you can take on c6 and double the pawns and actually just remove the defender of the d pawn. And this should be a really nice position for white. I believe I might have even had that one in a game before. So after bishop d5, black really should just focus on completing their development as fast as possible. And white is going to take on c6 and remove the defender of this pawn. So, okay, white has gotten their pawn back and is starting to develop their pieces in an active position, try and make use of the fact that these pawns are doubled and isolated. And this might come way later in the game. We see black castle and bishop to f4 developing to a nice natural square, but you're not looking to capture on d6. If you capture on d6, black can simply recapture with their pawn, fix their pawn structure, or maybe even just take with the bishop, and maybe in the future they'll have something like bishop g4 takes on f3 and queen h4. So not really looking to capture right away, just looking to develop, get that piece off of the back rank. And there is this idea of rook to b8, and at first it looks like this pawn on a7 is hanging, but do not take it. If you take it, they can take on b2, and now black's pieces are starting to look active, and white's positional plus with their pawn structure is starting to disappear. Instead, b3. b3 supporting it with the other pawns. There's no problem with this. I don't see why white should be any worse. And black can just continue with natural moves. Rook e8, knight to d2, bishop f6 hitting the queen, and now it's very important you play the right move here, bishop to e5. Anything else, white will start losing material because bishop f6 does come with a skewer. So please do not, don't just move the queen. Do block with the bishop, take the trades in the center, and rather than move back this way, we see white go to f4, and the point is you're putting more pressure on the position, and stuff like knight c4, maybe a knight e4 can be a bit stronger. If this knight ever moves, you are threatening stuff like queen f7 or knight f7, which, even if it may not be objectively best, would scare me if I had the black pieces. But okay, rook f to e1 just developing, and we see both sides finish their development very naturally. And here, I do think white stands better. I think the knights are more active. I don't really see... I mean, I guess this light square bishop does hit the pawns, so white does have to be careful of that, but the rook placement, the active queen, the knights are ready to jump into active positions. This knight on e5 is already pretty good. I don't see why white would be any worse. And black clearly has these weaknesses on the c file and a file. The pawns just are not helping each other out. So I think this one does favor white. I don't see why black should go for this line, but I figured I should mention it because it is possible. Materialistically, it is fine, but positionally, I don't believe in it all that much. Gabriella Schmoller just subscribed. Thank you. All right. So that covers the Dubois Reti defense. I'll give you guys just a couple seconds in case there's any questions on that. Otherwise, we're going to move into the Nakmanson Gambit. All right. I'm not seeing any big questions about the positional stuff. It's time to start talking about exciting chess. We're going to get into the Nakmanson Gambit. There are many move orders to reach this, and some may be wondering why I'm including this in the Scotch course. But it's because sometimes people will find themselves in these positions from the Dubois Reti where it's very positional, and they don't want to play this. They want to play something sharper, something with more attacking chances. So I'm going to give a lot of credit here to our very own Jonathan Schrantz for bringing the Nakhmanson Gambit to life a year or two ago, really popularizing it. And really ever since he did his YouTube video on it, it just kind of exploded in popularity. But this will be the first time I believe we've had a Nakmansen, I guess, study on our channel. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about the accepted Nakmansen, and then I think the best way black can decline it. So the way you reach the Nakmansen from a Scotch move order, well, we have our Scotch game right here, and after takes and bishop c4, after knight f6, the next sideline, or I guess the first sideline that you can play, aside from the main line e5, is to castle. And this is offering a secondary pawn. So why not take it? Black can go right ahead. And here white has a couple different ideas. One, they can start with rook to e1. This is the most popular move, which is met with d5. And then moves like bishop takes d5 are possible, because after the queen takes, there is knight c3. You're attacking the knight on e4 twice, and you're hitting the queen, and the queen cannot take because of the pin. So that is its own thing. But I figured if you're going to deviate from the e5 lines, you probably should play the Nakmansen. A lot of only moves for black, a couple only moves for white. But the Nakmansen Gambit here is with knight to c3. And not only did you give up your initial pawn on d4, not only did you give up the pawn on e4, but now you're offering this piece. So we're going to look at what happens if black takes, which really opens up the chances for white to attack like crazy. Starting with bishop f7. You sacrificed one piece, 2 pawns, now you're giving up a bishop. White's just giving all their material away. And here, black should take the piece. If they don't, if they go king to e7, this is winning immediately for white with either queen to d5 or even the very simple bishop to d5. Just bring the piece out of danger. You're attacking the knight. If this knight moves, rook to e1 is going to hit the king with check. You're going to run into some big problems here. So black really should take on f7. And now probably the most natural move in the position, queen to d5. So it sounds like we have some people in the chat who have seen this before. If you have not seen this before, I want you guys to take a guess at what black's best move is here in this position. It's not easy. The queen is checking the king. Your options are f6, g6, e7, and e8. We have our own Alex in the chat. Black's best move is to resign. Yeah, I don't know if the best move is to resign. Okay, we do have a suggestion for king g6, which unfortunately just doesn't work. Queen takes e4 with check. The king has to move again to the f file. If you end up going king h5, very funny pawn g4 checkmate exists. So king has to move back somewhere like f7. And here knight g5 is just crushing it. If king to g8, queen d5 is mate. And if king f6, there's a mate in 4 here. Queen f4, king goes back to g6, queen f7, and now the king is very quickly running out of squares. King h6, g4 threatening queen h5 mate. So you have to play g6. And after g6, there is the very beautiful knight e6 check. And if g5, blocking the bishop, instead of taking the queen, queen h5 mate. So unfortunately, king g6 just doesn't work. There's checkmates around every corner. The best move in this position is actually the surprising king f6, but we'll get back to this in just a second. I do want to cover the other 2 moves, king e7 and king e8. First, king to e7. This is a blunder on a massive scale. After king to e7, there is bishop to g5. And at first, it looks like you're just letting it be taken by the knight. I should also mention, if they block with the knight, rook f to e1, and then knight to e5, and then queen takes. Or sorry, not queen takes, rook takes. Queen needs to guard f7 here. Is mate, so they actually need to take it with the knight. And it looks like you're giving up yet another piece, but the very nice part about this is black's king is on the open file. You do have multiple other pieces in the position. We're going to start with knight g5, threatening queen f7 to drag the king out. And here, okay, there's 3 tries that I thought I saw. Really, king f6 is the only move to keep them anywhere near alive. But, okay, let's say you're not a computer, you don't see king f6. What else can you try? Well, what if you try just g6, something really slow to develop your bishop? This fails to queen f7, king to d6, and here there's a very, very fine move, knight e4 check. Anything else, white is going to be equal. Knight e4 is the only move that will lead to a checkmate. So if you are playing the Nakhmansen, you come across this position, you must remember knight e4. This forces the king to e5, and now you're going to start using the rest of your pieces to kind of build a cage around the king and eventually lock it down. So rook a to d1, this is immediately threatening something like queen b5, or even rook to d5, just checkmating the king on the spot. So knight to b4, stopping rook to d5. Now there's f4 check, king e4, and rook f to e1. So g6, something so like this doesn't work. And if you try b6, a very similar story with queen f7. And if you try d6, it's just mate in 1. So unfortunately, king e7 will lose because of this. I do also want to mention, after b6, trying to open up this side, queen f7, king d6, and rook a d1 check. After king c5 and rook d5, king c4. I just wanted to show this position because one of my old chess coaches loved Stochi's mate in 2s. And right here is a mate in 3, so I wanted to give this one, if you're looking for a nice little headache, try and find the mate in 3. But okay, we're going to move on from this. King e7, bad move. Don't ever play it. But I do want to cover king e8. King e8 does give some very nice practical tries for black. In fact, the king e8 lines, a lot of them do lead to black still being slightly better. But white needs to be very careful. There are a lot of players with the white pieces who blunder and take the knight with the queen with check. But the problem with this is it opens up, or not really opens up, it allows black to block on e7 without is needing to spend another move to do so. Black already wants to play bishop e7, and here white is just forcing him to do that. So, unfortunately, this doesn't quite work just yet. What you should do is go rook f to e1, hit the knight. The knight is pinned to the king, so you will get this piece back, don't worry. And there's 2 tries. I guess the first try we'll look at is its own mess of variations, bishop to e7. But in this line with bishop to e7 here, I found that there's like a lot of forcing moves, like only moves that black needs to play just to survive, and I think in the end they're slightly worse, so I don't recommend it, but I think white does need to know what to do. So after bishop to e7 here, we see rook to e4, and black has like 3 different tries they can go for. If they try something slow like h6, stopping bishop to g5, there's a very nice additional sacrifice of bishop h6. And, okay, let's say rook takes h6. This is mate in 1. And let's say they see the mate in 1 and they take with the pawn. Well, now there's queen h5 check, drawing the king out. And now after rook f4, bishop f6, queen g6, there's no way to save yourself on f6. Rook takes is going to lead to the loss of a queen for black. So there is this, if they play slowly with h6, something like that. There is also rook to f8, which doesn't quite work out. There is bishop to g5, piling up on e7. And if d6, rook a to e1. And now all of white's pieces start serving a purpose. Black's best move is to take on b2, and now white can just start taking on e7. And after queen to b5 check, you do fork the king and the pawn. I don't think black is getting anything out of this. Should be fine for white. So that leads us to the best move for black is to play d6, is to kind of help open this up for our pieces to develop and kind of control this e5 square. But bishop g5 hitting the bishop yet again. We have king f8, and black is going to miraculously hold on. Rook a to e1, met with bishop f6. So this is one of those only moves that I was talking about. Bishop f6 is the only way to survive. Stuff like rook f4 is going to be very nasty. Maybe even taking on e7 followed by knight g5 could hurt. So bishop to f6 really gets ahead of all of this right away. And one of the common ideas white will have is to play b4. I'm just checking our chat again. I did see Stud07 has followed. Thank you for the follow. But one of the common ideas in the Nakmansen is to play b4 and shut down this idea of them taking on b2. Really gives us one less thing to worry about. And now after something like queen d7, the point of queen d7 is to go to f7 and trade off the queens. Normally, white is just going to avoid this and keep the queens on the board. And now after something like knight g8, again, trying to go to f7 and get the queen active. But yeah, after bishop h4 and h5, through computer defense, black can hold. However, it's going to require a lot of prep from black to know all of this. But again, I don't think bishop e7 is the friendliest for humans. If you do play bishop e7 as black, you really should have a lot of those lines memorized. Now, some of you may be wondering why I'm not covering all of the moves. That is because our own Jonathan Trance has released a chessable course on the Nakmansen. So if you do want to see any of these Nakmansen lines in more depth, definitely check it out on Chessable. Jonathan, you're welcome for the plug. Okay, so after rook e1, I don't like bishop e7. Knight e7 is probably the absolute best try for black. Hitting the queen right away. And if white ends up taking on e4, this can lead to some immediate problems after d5 because you're hitting the queen with tempo and opening up the lines for your pieces, which is not what you want to allow black to do. You're really wanting to try and restrict them. So the way you do this is by taking with the rook, and now the knight is pinned to the king, so your queen is not attacked, and this does not allow d5 to come and hit your pieces. There is c6 though. This does hit your queen. This is actually black's best try here. But white can just move queen h5, end up hitting black back with their own attack. And after blocking with g6, queen to e5. Now they're hitting the rook. So really the only move here for black is to move the rook. Unfortunately, this is a pretty easy only move to remember. You just defend your piece. Bishop to g5, attacking e7 again, and after rook a to e1, white may just end up winning a piece back. So black has to play very actively. And the most active way to play here is just expand in the center. Pawn to d5, hitting this rook, and now the rook must move. And one of the very common ideas in the Nakmansen is just go rook f4, and you're controlling the f-file and coming down this way. Unfortunately, in this particular position, this does not work, and it's because of h6, and your bishop doesn't really have anywhere to go. If your bishop goes to h4, it's met with g5, and your pieces are being forked. And if you go bishop to f6, there is still pawn to g5, and now this rook doesn't really have anywhere to go that will help keep up the attack. Right, so really no good place for this rook if you just go rook d4. They can take on b2 first if they would like, and then your rook moves, but now something like rook g6 even, or king f7, and they are holding on. Looks a little scary. Looks like there should be a way to punish this, but unfortunately, there's no good way for white to control the light squares. So they can't take advantage of this king on f7. So, unfortunately. We do have more comments coming in. Ninja Capo, will this be on YouTube later? Ideally, yes. We're going to try and get this VOD off of Twitch and onto YouTube. And then also asking to cover every move in chess. Eventually. We'll get there. But okay, rook f4 doesn't work, so instead, just drop the rook back. Rook to e3. You are hitting the pawn. It's not that big of a deal. If they end up taking, you can still move your rook to the e file, and you're looking to capture on e7, or even just take on b2 later. So black does best by just developing. They bring their bishop out. Rook a to e1. Bishop to e4, cutting off the coordination of our heavy pieces. And now with their bishop to f6, bishop h6, and rook takes c3. Rook f8, I can't explain all of these moves. I honestly cannot. The engine loves finding moves that we don't understand. But through, again, more computer defense, black is doing fine. And I think this line specifically where black is up the piece, I think is a lot easier to remember than the bishop e7 lines. The moves are a little bit more natural. And if white isn't careful, they can turn this equal position into a loss very quickly because black is up the piece. They just need to black just need to be careful. Don't let the heavies coordinate and take advantage of these light squares because white doesn't have the light square bishop anymore. Yes, I know these moves are inhuman, and I had to somehow prepare a lecture over them. But okay, there's our king e8 lines. We're going to get into the king f6 lines now, and then I will cover the Nakmansen declined. Okay, so the king f6 lines, I don't have them as wide as the king e8 lines, but we will get into our Nakmansen here after knight c3, d takes, bishop f7, king f7, queen d5, and now king f6. So someone who has done their homework or watched any lecture on the Nakmansen should know king f6 is the best move here. And black does seem to hold. So as usual, taking the knight with the queen immediately is not the best move. Here, it is met with bishop to e7, which looks like it's going to cause problems because you are cutting off this square for the king. But I assure you, black is doing just fine. If white goes knight to g5, is met with d5, queen f4 check, and bishop f5. So the bishop will come and be defended by the king. This early in the game, the king is already a part of it as a unit. He is helping to defend. White can go with rook to e1 to try and get another piece into the action. Rook e6 is a big threat. If a6 is played, rook e6 is checkmate. So be careful. And if you have the white pieces, be on the lookout. So we will see black go queen d7 to stop this checkmate. White should still go for the check anyway, because this will force black to give up the queen. And after king takes e6, queen takes c7, rook to c8, and queen b7, rook b8. Queen a6, all these moves are rather forcing, so I won't be spending too much time explaining them. Black can take on b2, bishop takes b2, and now not rook takes because it will hang with check, king f7. And unfortunately, black seems to be doing better. You have a rook for rook, bishop for bishop, and you're looking at black having, what, one less pawn? You have a rook and two minor pieces for the queen, which materialistically is already better. And the pieces, while they aren't all coordinated on one specific target, are going to be pretty easy to coordinate with each other. Okay, someone's asking if you sacrifice the exchange on e5, does that help? Let's see where that could be. I don't think it's going to be Whoops. I most definitely just skipped the line. Sacrificing the exchange on e5. How? Oh, like 5 minutes ago? Oh, man. I don't know. If you include move numbers in the variation, it'll be easier to be able to help. I'm now realizing you guys don't have access to move numbers, so I'll fix that for next time. But okay. That's unfortunate. I am sorry that I missed that. But okay. Queen takes e4 is a mistake. Black does have a defense there. Instead, you go rook e1, get the rook into the position first. And now black's best move here, knight e7. If they do try something slow with pawn to h6, this is pretty much refuted after rook takes, and rook f4 is a very nice resource you have here. So bishop d6 to stop that. Bishop to f4, trying to get rid of the piece that's stopping your plan. King g6, and our king is going to be hiding on h7 here eventually. So while the king is kind of safe, queen d3 does run into this problem of a discovery, so it does force king g8, and now you get both of your rooks lined up for the back rank trying to win a queen. So unfortunately, while it looks safe at first, this is just this is winning for white. There's no way to really stop this attack. You have to give up the knight. And then, in that case, while material may be equal, black's king is by no means any degree safe. So h6, something slow like that is just not gonna cut it. So we do go knight e7. And now queen takes e4. Your queen was attacked. You also want to get your piece back. Let's take the piece. And now, another only move, king f7. King f7, trying to save the king. Now, if black tries something like d5, this seems very natural. It's protected multiple times. It's attacking the queen. This does fail to queen f4. Queen f4, bishop f5, the same idea we saw in one of the previous lines. Runs into knight d4. They are hitting f5 again. There are better moves here as well, but again, check out Jonathan's course on Chessable. But knight d4 is just going to be my easy recommendation. Again, rook e6 is a big threat, so they need to stop that. So queen d6, and now there are some nice moves, but I like queen g5, and after king f7, you take on f5, and after queen f6, you can take on e7. And here, I think that white is doing just fine. No big problems. White is actually the one who is up the pawn now. Not the most beautiful structure. At the same time, black doesn't have a fantastic one on the king side either. I think this would lead to a very nice endgame for white. But through research, we have found king f7 will hold, and is still better for black. After king f7, something like bishop to g5 is very natural. You pin the knight, get your last piece out. Now d5 actually does work for black, because now after queen f4 check, there is king g8, and the king does hide. And now we don't have a follow-up check. We can try queen e5, trying to put more pressure on some of these pieces here. Trying to see what else is at the ready, but black can take on b2. Rook moves. You will open up this file eventually. I also want to make the note, taking on b2 with the queen is a very, very big mistake. Black can play h6, hitting the bishop, and your bishop has to either trade or retreat. And after trading, I actually don't see what is wrong with black's position anymore. The king is relatively safe, and it looks like black is just up a bishop and a pawn. So rook a d1 and king h7. This king is just completely safe. There's no way in. Knight g5 doesn't help, even if you could. You're going to be sacrificing way too many pieces. You're not going to have any pieces left to attack anymore. So queen b2, unfortunately, doesn't work. You can't allow h6 to come and attack the bishop. Now, h6 can come anyway, but the trade is a little bit different because now you can take on e7. So Definitely differences in the position. But black's best try here is probably knight g6 hitting the queen. You trade queens. You take their piece. And now after c6, here we seem to have a problem. White will be getting this pawn back, but white is still down a pawn. And black has the bishop pair. So if you ask anyone who knows theoretical endgames or likes, you know, those Russian schoolboy sayings of bishop pair is good, bishop pair is good. I think here, the nice open board, the very healthy pawns that black has does give black a very nice endgame. I don't know why Jonathan loves this so much. I gotta be honest. This one looks pretty rough to play. But there is still a game here. If you end up getting to this position, which I highly doubt it, getting here requires a lot of study by both sides, actually. But even if you get here, black will still have to demonstrate endgame knowledge and be able to convert. So I don't think it's the easiest thing in the world. So, yes. That's correct. No one is going to be finding these moves over the board. Okay, so that's the Nakmansen accepted, which is probably black's best try. But if black is trying to avoid all these computer moves, or they don't even know what's happening and they're afraid that white is super prepared, they can decline the gambit, and there's a couple different tries they have. But let me get into my recommendation here of after knight to c3. The most common way people decline is just trading knights. If you don't know what's going on, just trading the pieces and accepting your material advantage that you already have is probably a safer way to go in general. And now let's talk about what white should do. White should take back on c3. You don't want to give up too much material and be passive. And now black has to make a decision on how they're going to continue. The first move, d takes c3, is a very big mistake because of rook e1. And after bishop to e7, it looks like you're fine. But knight g5 coming to hit f7 forces black to castle. And here, there's queen h5. And this is just a monster attack. If h6, knight takes f7, and you're losing material, bishop f7 is actually going to lead to a mate. And if you try bishop g5, well, after bishop g5, well, look at that. Your queen has been trapped. If knight e7, bishop takes, your queen is still trapped. So, unfortunately, d takes c3, not good for black at all. A little too slow. Instead, they should look for something more active, or even just shutting down white's play. So I quite like bishop e7 here. C takes d4, you get the pawn back, and now you go d5. You can hit the bishop. And now black can start playing more natural moves compared to what we've been seeing, while still maintaining, you know, the bishop pair and a reasonable pawn structure with natural moves. So all these moves starting to make more sense to us. There's a pin. White tries to break the pin. Black takes. Rook to b1, getting on the open file. And bishop to a3. These moves seem so easy now that we've gone through all the computer stuff. But now bishop d6 and queen c3. I think this is rather balanced, and if anyone's for choice, it's probably black with the extra pawn, but white does have some nice activity. So I wouldn't blame black for choosing this. The other option they have, rather than bishop e7 right away, is d5 right away. Kind of forcing bishop to go to b5, and bishop e7 is probably the best response. I do want to cover d takes c3 here. It is better than before. If rook to e1, now black has the choice of blocking with either bishop on the e file, and white just doesn't have the development to really take advantage of this right now. So this should be fine. They also have bishop to d6 right away, which allows rook to come to e1, but again, blocking with the bishop on e6 is always a choice. And here, we will see white capture on d4, putting more pressure on c6. And here, actually, black needs to be careful. They need to be willing to give up the pawn. The only way that they can claim to be any better is just by developing rapidly. taking on c6 actually should be okay for black because of this captures on h2 move. And now queen d6, and this is actually how black's going to retain an advantage here. So definitely some tricks both sides need to be aware of. After castles, white should take on e6 and then take on e6 again with the rook. And here like queen d7 and rook e1 is going to be fine. If black really wants to draw, they can actually force a draw with, where is it? Bishop h2 here. And after king takes is just going to be checks with the queen until either 50 moves or 3-move repetition, depending on if draw offers are allowed or not. So with this bishop to d6 line, there is a way for black to force a draw if they so choose, which can be unfortunate for white. But okay, d5, bishop b5, and bishop to e7 seems to be one of the major choices. And now after takes on c6, takes on c6, and knight e5, if you take on d4, it allows black to castle. If you play knight e5, they cannot castle. If they do castle, knight c6, and they do give up a bishop, which is one of the main sources of black's counterplay, being able to use both of the bishops effectively. So they should defend the pawn. And now something like queen f3, threatening mate, but also just getting the queen to a more active position. In general, black can castle, and now cd4. And here starts to wrap up our analysis after f6, and the knight trades itself off. We have bishop a3 offering the trade of dark squared bishops, and while black is up a pawn, they do have a weaker pawn structure than white. These doubled pawns might be hard to make progress with, and after bishop to d6, I think you have a very balanced game. And this is the Nakmansen declined. This is probably what I think is black's best shot against the Nakmansen, so I think white should know this. Again, there's plenty of other moves. There's no way I can fit in everything about the Nakmansen. That's going to be its own 20-part course if I try and do it. So, again, one last time, if you want to see them in deeper detail, Shance's course on Chessable. All right, that is our analysis. We are done with part 3 of the Scotch. This is the knight f6 lines in the Scotch Gambit. I will wait a minute here for any questions, and then we will wrap up the stream here. Man, that was a lot. So much theory. We're gonna have to wait 5 minutes because sounds like some people are watching a little bit behind. Oh, it's a pleasure. You guys are welcome. It's always great to do this for you guys. Yes, again, we are going to try and put this up on YouTube. The release schedule on YouTube is a little out of order right now, so hopefully we'll be able to get that all sorted out, but definitely planning to have this on YouTube for you guys. Don't worry about it. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so I'm going to assume everything made perfect sense, everything's crystal clear, and everyone's going to start beating everyone with the Scotch Gambit or suffering. So, thank you everyone for coming and watching tonight. This was part 3 of our Scotch series. I'm Nick Risko. You guys have a good night. We will try and find someone to raid. I think Tracy's going to get on that. Oh, she wants me to end the stream. Okay. Yeah, you can be overwhelmed. There's a lot. But all right, you guys have a good night. I will see you next week.